Some of the singers and bands I have talked about on this channel more than once were involved into this project, so it felt like a non-brainer. The overall concept and the result of this soundtrack was unlike anything we've heard before or since. So let's talk about the original soundtrack for The Queen of the Damned. But before we get to that, I think we should briefly talk about the film itself. The film is loosely based on the third novel of Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles series, The Queen of the Damned, with many plot elements taken from the second book, The Vampire Lestat. In 1994, her first novel in this series, Interview with the Vampire, was made into a film and was received with great critical reception and approval from fans of the book as well as Anne Rice herself. The film received several Oscar nominations and Kirsten Dunst was nominated for a Golden Globe, and the cast of the film most definitely had an effect on how the film was received, thanks to names like Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt, and Antonio Banderas. So one would expect the follow-up to be decent in the very least, but unfortunately it wasn't so. The lead, Vampire Lestat, was now portrayed by Stuart Townsend instead of Tom Cruise. But honestly, Townsend did a good job with his portrayal, even though his accent was quite inconsistent. The main antagonist, Queen of the Damned, Akasha, was portrayed by R&B singer Aaliyah. This ultimately became her last role, as she died in a plane crash before the movie was even released. She did a good job as well, as she was quite captivating in this role. The rest of the characters, however, were rather bland and boring, so I don't think it's necessary to mention them. I think it had a lot to do with poor writing in this film, and a budget that was half of what its predecessor was made for. As a result, action scenes and visual effects were poorly made. Upon its release, the film received mostly negative reviews from critics and fans of the book. The author of the book, Anne Rice herself, dismissed this film. However, it still did relatively well by making $45.5 million at the box office. I think that first of all, the financial success of the film had a lot to do with this being the last film appearance by Aaliyah, and the second reason was probably because some of the biggest bands of that time were involved into making of this soundtrack, which I think is one of the main reasons the film studio wanted to produce a film based on this book specifically, where Lestat becomes a rock star, because in the early 2000s rock and metal music were pretty much mainstream, and so were these artists involved in this project, with many of them selling millions of records at the dawn of 21st century. So I bet the film studio imagined there would be an audience for this, apart from the fans of Vampire Chronicles, and there was, but they seem to have forgotten to make the film itself as good as the soundtrack turned out to be. Michael Reimer, the director of the film, from the very beginning of the production, prioritized the music that would be presented in this film, as it plays an integral part in the plot of the film, as the lead, Vampire Lestat, would indeed be singing in the film. So it was important to know early on what his voice would sound like. And it just so happened that Jonathan Davis was looking for a new challenge and wanted to branch out a little from what he was usually doing with Korn. So he took the job alongside another composer, Richard Gibbs, who up to that point has worked on films such as Dr. Dolittle, Big Mama's House, and the first season of The Simpsons. Even though his dreadlocks could mean that he probably was into alternative music, in a way his experience indicates that he might have been out of his element when it came to The Queen of the Damned. So I'm sure this is where Jonathan Davis was helpful. In return, Jonathan got to learn about writing a score for a film. The work on music began even before the casting for the film started, so in a way the music set the tone for the entire film, with the direction from Michael Reimer, of course. Even though we got to hear Jonathan's voice in the film, his contract with his record label did not allow him to appear on the soundtrack album. And this is where things got interesting, because we got to experience 5 songs from this album performed by Jonathan in the film and by other singers on the officially released soundtrack. So let's go a little deeper and talk about these performances one by one. Manson was the only one who has been on the alternative scene as long as Jonathan was, and he said that he would not have agreed to work on this soundtrack if it wasn't for Jonathan's involvement. Manson should have been the perfect candidate for this song because few can do those lows as well as he did. But on this track his voice did not work as well as I would have expected. It just sounds very messy. Manson has this habit of using a lot of vocal tracks in his songs, and Redeemer is no different. But usually he sounds much better. I think this not such a great result has a lot to do with how the song was mixed. The vocals just did not blend together that well. On the chorus you can distinctly hear at least 4 vocal tracks, and there can actually be even more than that. One pen to the right, one pen to the left, main vocal in the middle, and high screams also in the middle. These 2 tracks in the middle seem to clash with each other and both demand attention.
They say I cannot be this, I am jaded, hiding from the day.
Overall, the vocal tracks are not very well balanced in terms of levels, so it's hard to understand where your focus as a listener should really go. Now, of course, using many vocal tracks is a common practice in rock music, and everyone on this soundtrack does it. But the rest of the tracks are just much better balanced, to a point where you can't quite tell how many vocal tracks there are, and that's how it's supposed to be. Jonathan himself is a big fan of harmonies and usage of many vocal tracks, especially on the choruses. But he usually sounds more organic, and in this instance, his performance of Redeemer is far superior to that of Manson's. It's just more balanced and tidy, especially on the chorus. Also, JD has somewhat more of a whimsical vibe that would be characteristic for a sort of exaggerated theatrical vampire representation, especially on the verses.
It is calling me for the blood of man.
Jonathan sort of gets into a character, while Manson just sings this one as himself.
Always it is calling me for the blood of man.
Performance by Jay Gordon I would have expected to be my least favorite, as I'm far less familiar with his work, but it's not. It is, however, the most different to what Jonathan did, since Jay does not use any distortion on his voice on this track, and overall he is more of a clean singer, while in Jonathan's case distortion is one of his defining qualities. The verses by Jay sound quite solid.
Walking, waiting, alone without a care.
While the choruses seem to be lacking in comparison to Jonathan's take. I think that Gordon's performance provides a different kind of texture to the soundtrack overall, so I think it was a good call by Jonathan to try and use a different type of singer in order to provide that versatility. This performance by Wayne is really solid. He mentioned that this was an interesting experience for him since he did not write the song, so he had to approach this song from Jonathan's perspective while bringing something of his own to the table. I think he brings a great take on this, with his distinctive aggressive delivery that is impossible to confuse with anyone else.
So what you got? One last shot, it seems to me.
And his more relaxed delivery on the chorus really brings in some nice dynamics into the song.
Trapped in this world, lonely and fading, heartbroken waiting for you to come.
I think Wayne is one of those singers who gets overlooked a lot, and on this song, to me personally, he brings a more versatile and better performance than JD does. But I think I prefer Jonathan's take on the pre-chorus more than that of Wayne's.
The jury is coming to tear me apart.
But overall, I think in this particular song, Jonathan seems to be going at the same pace with the same intensity throughout the track, while Wayne brings a slightly more dynamic performance to the table. Important to mention that Cold, a song from Static X's second album, has also made it to the soundtrack, and it fits perfectly with the theme of this film. And the music video made for it was really good and probably looks better than the actual film does. Chester decided to join forces with Jonathan on this because he was a big fan of Vampire Chronicles. Also, Jonathan made a guest appearance on Linkin Park's remix album Reanimation, but it's hard to tell what the timeline for that was exactly, since the Queen of the Damned soundtrack was released a few months sooner than Reanimation. Even though Reanimation was recorded during 2001, I feel that both artists in a way honor each other and had a good working relationship. Also, Chester, as a fan of the books, pointed out that Jonathan and Richard did a good job of writing lyrics that were fitting for the character of Lestat. So, System is easily my favorite track on this effort. The thing I like about it the most is that it consistently keeps the same mood, while still keeping things interesting with some vocal progressions, especially in case of Chester's version. While verses by both JD and Chester are equally good, I think Chester does a better job on the chorus.
Why won't you die?
Chester holds longer notes, which I think works better in this chorus. Plus, he adds a harmony here on We'll Be Fine.
We'll be fine.
And sings the same harmony on the entirety of the last chorus. It just provides that extra layer of progression which makes the song more interesting to listen to, instead of hearing the chorus performed the same way throughout the song, which is the case when it comes to Jonathan's delivery. That's why I think Chester effectively improved the song from a writing point of view. The bridge part I also find to be better when performed by Chester.
Why is everything so fucking hard for me?
Strangely, Chester took a more aggressive approach in this section, and I think it just works better than Jonathan's take, where it seems like he's relatively holding back.
Why is everything so fucking hard for me?
Finally, we get to the best performance on this thing, which is delivered by Jonathan Davis, of course.
You see, I'm burning in unbelievers, clouded by memories of the past.
No one can quite pull off what he did on the verses of this song. Even now, after I've heard this song many times, I listen to it and it just blows my mind each time. The song overall is my second favorite right after System. As for David's performance, I have to be honest, I was never a big fan of his, even though I acknowledge that he is indeed a great vocalist with a distinct style. But to me he just seems a little too traditional, so in comparison to Jonathan's version, David seems to lack that emotional input that Jonathan has in spades.
See, I cannot be mistaken, because I'm not the only one.
But the goal of guest vocalists on this was not to replicate what Jonathan would do, but to give this soundtrack a second life of sorts and hear it from a different perspective. And in that regard, Draiman does a great job at delivering yet another flavor to this beautiful collaboration. Draiman's band Disturbed also got to put their biggest hit, Down With The Sickness, on this soundtrack. And there were other good songs on this soundtrack which were not written specifically for this film. Most notably among these was Change by Deftones, which was very fitting to the vibe of this film and was even used in the most captivating scene of the film. And I'm sure that for many this was the first introduction to Deftones. I in fact heard Change for the first time thanks to this film, and I loved it from the very first second. So this is my take on the Queen of the Damned film and soundtrack. Film, honestly, not so great. It's quite corny and not that well written. But I am glad it happened because the soundtrack we got out of it is absolutely beautiful. Obviously, this is mostly my opinions, but I tried my best to leave my personal feelings on the table and approached this one as objectively as I possibly could. Before I wrap this up, I think we should appreciate and remember that 3 people involved in this project are no longer with us. Leave your thoughts below on which performances you liked best, Jonathan's or some of the other great singers that appeared on this. And maybe share your feelings about the film too while you're at it. I hope you had a fun and spooky Halloween, and I hope to see you in the next one. Take care.